You are listening to Practical and Woo by Mindset and Manifest. My name is Eden, and I invite you to embark on a journey with me to explore the practical and spiritual edges of the unknown for the purpose of allowing you to embody and empower yourself uniquely as you are and to intentionally create and live a life of freedom and fulfillment. Each week, I am going to discuss topics such as energetics, reality creation, manifestation, astrology, tarot, and more to help empower you to live beyond perceived limitations and to practically design your life so it feels like absolute magic every step of the way. Let's dive in. Well, hello, brilliant soul. I feel like I'm dreaming. When I went to deliver today's episode to you, I noticed we were on episode 190, even though just yesterday it felt like I launched episode 1 to the world and to you. 190 episodes later, it feels like a completion of sorts, but also somehow a beginning, a testament to that which is yet to unfold. I'm so glad to meet you in this space and to commemorate episode 190. So I thought in this celebration, I could bring to you a story episode. As always, feel free to listen with an open heart to receive the message that lies beyond any symbols, metaphors, descriptions from this kind of episode. Also, feel free to treat it like a special ritual just for you. You can get a snack, a delightful beverage, and perhaps even the curiosity of a second grader sitting down for Story Circle. I know this imagery already lit me up, and hopefully it did the same for you. There was once a kingdom so prosperous that neighboring lands spoke of its remarkable harmony. Ambassadors returned home describing elegant banquets where the laughter seemed effortless, where council meetings had disagreements that seemed to rarely turn to conflict. And they also had these celebrations in which every guest seemed perfectly at ease. It became fashionable to say that if peace could be built anywhere, it was already built there. But those who lived inside the palace knew something different, that peace and ease are not the same thing. The palace itself had been expanded over generations, with each ruler adding another wing rather than replacing what had come before. Corridors bent unexpectedly into sunlit courtyards. Marble staircases ended beside cedar balconies overlooking vineyards that rolled towards distant hills. The historic halls were equipped with vaulted ceilings that opened into intimate libraries lined with walnut shelves polished by centuries of hands. Every room carried traces of those who had occupied it before, and every room seemed to have its own custom that no one questioned and everyone abided by. Into this world came Lady Diane. She had not been raised for court life. Her father governed a smaller province where people spoke plainly because everyone already knew one another. A disagreement was rarely remembered beyond the next harvest. And if someone laughed too loudly, another laughed louder. If someone changed their mind, they simply said so. Life moved with the rhythm of weather more than reputation. When she married the king's youngest brother, Lady Diane entered the palace believing kindness would be enough. And to a degree it was, but what she longed for more than anything was to belong. At first, the differences in customs fascinated her. She noticed how quickly people anticipated one another's preferences and how everyone knew the dance of when to speak and when to stay silent. She assumed she would learn the steps, and instead, she became consumed by them. She noticed that Lady Miriam wore emerald whenever the queen held a council, and so Diane began wearing emerald too. Lord Cassian quoted philosophers over dinner, and soon she was requesting the same scrolls from the library. When the ladies of the eastern apartments praised archery, she listened carefully enough to repeat their observations a week later as though they became her own. She learned which humor earned warm smiles and which stories quietly dissolved conversation. She became remarkably good at reading the room before the room had even settled. People admired how she had adapted, and they would comment on how beautifully she fit in. But what they didn't know is that she replayed every experience she had in her mind. And so each compliment paid only to relieve her for a brief moment. Did I laugh too soon? Should I have spoken less? Did I seem knowledgeable enough? Was I too enthusiastic? Was I not enthusiastic enough? Lady Diane became fluent in a language no one admitted they were speaking. Soon, months became years, and the palace embraced her more warmly with every season, while she, all the while, felt strangely transparent. One spring, an ambassador arrived from a distant republic across the inland sea. His purpose concerned trade, though few people remembered the negotiations. What they did remember was that he possessed an unusual steadiness. He was courteous without flattery, observant without appearing suspicious, and entirely unmoved by the shifting currents of favor that occupied so much of palace life. He seemed equally comfortable speaking with stable hands, scholars, princes, cooks, queens, and everyone in between. People found him difficult to categorize, and that alone made him all the more interesting. Lady Diane first noticed him because he never seemed to perform. Not rebellion, not charm, not indifference. He seemed simply himself, and she wondered about him and the mechanics that made him tick. Was it his confidence or the fact that he just came from somewhere else? Several times, Lady Diane and the ambassador found themselves walking the same gardens, bantering in a way about everything and anything that she hadn't experienced in a long time. Their conversations required no effort, and this effortlessness felt curious to her. So one afternoon, while watching gardeners replant an orchard damaged by winter frost, Ambassador Collins asked her, almost absent-mindedly, "May I ask you something?" Lady Diane nodded. "Which version of you have I met today?" She laughed politely. "I don't understand." "I've noticed," he said gently, "that you become slightly different depending on who enters the conversation." She waited. "I've spent weeks wondering which version is yours." The words were delivered without any kind of accusation, but all she could muster in the moment was a shy smile and an attempt to abruptly change the subject. Lady Diane spent the entire evening unable to sleep, and over the following days, she tried to convince herself that he had simply misunderstood. She was just considerate, adaptable, diplomatic. But soon the veil unfurled on her excuses, and she noticed what was there all along. With the queen, she became measured. With the scholars, she was intellectuals. With the soldiers, decisive. With the artists, she showed her imagination. And while none of these selves were necessarily false, somehow none of them felt entirely true either. Lady Diane began wondering whether she possessed a center at all, or whether she had become a collection of reflections shaped by everyone around her. For several weeks, she withdrew from the conversation whenever she could, finding reasons to spend longer in the library or to walk farther into the vineyard. This was her attempt, perhaps, for the first time ever, to hear her own thoughts before they had been edited for someone else's comfort. In this process, Lady Diane discovered something surprising, that without other people nearby, she found herself rehearsing imaginary conversations anyway, explaining herself, defending herself, winning approval from audiences that existed only inside of her mind. It dawned on her that the palace had not taught her this habit, just rewarded it. She remembered childhood dinners where she learned which stories made adults laugh and which invited correction. She remembered teachers praising obedience more readily than originality. She remembered relatives calling her such an easy child, and how proud that description made her feel. Somewhere along the way, being well received became indistinguishable from being loved. And this was a realization that felt harder to carry than any criticism she ever received. Ambassador Collins departed before summer, and she had wished that he had stayed. And instead she remained with the question he unknowingly left behind. Who remains when you're no longer bound by the masks? Over the coming weeks, Lady Diane leaned into honesty instead of conjecture and platitudes. At council, when she didn't understand a proposal, she asked for clarification instead of pretending she knew what it was about. And during a hunt, she admitted that she hadn't ever enjoyed riding merely for sport. Two other ladies confessed they hadn't either, and one had assumed everyone else loved it, while another continued attending for years because declining simply felt impolite. Lady Diane blinked in disbelief and realized she wasn't alone in performing for others. She silently wondered how many more of them there were. At a banquet, she laughed so hard at an elderly archivist's dry observation that wine nearly spilled from her glass. For a moment, the energy in the room turned, and then the archivist burst into laughter too. Soon half the table joined them, and she noticed that nothing terrible happened in allowing her laughter to be authentic. Weeks later, Lady Diane wore deep blue to a ceremony where emerald had long been considered the expected color. She realized in these miniature feats that she no longer entered rooms asking who she should be, and instead learned how to remain herself amongst the customs of the palace. Curiously, the more she stopped pursuing approval, the more genuine her relationships became, at least the ones that mattered most. While some found her less predictable than before, those who remained began bringing more of themselves as well. Her friendships grew less and less dependent on silent, unspoken rules, and more dependent on trust. Years later, after the old king had passed and younger generations filled the palace, newcomers often remarked on the unusual atmosphere within the court. There were still customs, etiquette, politics, but there was also noticeably less pretending. Under Lady Diane's influence, so many others discovered they no longer wished to negotiate away the pieces of themselves, for belonging is not a reward bestowed on those already seated at the table, nor a prize waiting for flawless behavior. It's something subtler that travels from one person to another, and it just takes one person to risk arriving wholly themselves instead of carefully arranged to stir the dominoes. Fitting in asks us to become skilled at reading the room, but belonging asks us to remain able to recognize ourselves once we've entered it. The strongest communities, it would seem, are not those where everyone thinks alike or behaves the same, but those where fewer and fewer people feel compelled to disappear in order to stay at the table. Until next time.